So, when one number in a corporate ledger doesn't match the actual bank record, do you just dismiss it as irrelevant noise? Or do you immediately treat it as definitive proof of fraud? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into exactly how to evaluate discrepancies in digital forensics and corporate investigations, and we're going to use the strict evidentiary framework developed by Semvanski Labs to do it. We're opening with this critical question because right at that precise moment you find an anomaly, it is incredibly easy to fall into one of two intellectually lazy traps. You look at a record, something is off, and the immediate reflex is to either shrug it off entirely or to declare the case closed. And both of those reactions, they represent a fundamental failure of investigative discipline. To navigate past these traps, we're going to methodically break down a highly disciplined framework. We'll start with the false evidentiary binary, move through the scrutiny threshold, apply the 6-stage pattern test, look at calibrating investigative evidence, and finish up with the limits of that evidence and some practical actions. All right, part 1, the false evidentiary binary. Let's see how this builds our foundation for responsible analysis. Let's look at a really common, albeit anonymized, corporate scenario. Say a regional subsidiary reports a $50,000 vendor payment in an external declaration, but the actual bank transaction log shows a wire transfer of only $42,000. Now, your natural instinct is probably to immediately ask, well, why are these numbers different? But jumping straight to why actually skips a completely critical step. At its core, a discrepancy is fundamentally just a relationship between two representations of the same supposed reality. And this perfectly illustrates the danger of what we call the false binary. Look, if you treat this single discrepancy as completely irrelevant noise, meaning nothing to see here, you end up shielding questionable systems from the scrutiny they actually need. But if you leap to the exact opposite extreme and present that same discrepancy as definitive proof of misconduct, you are destroying the legitimacy of your entire investigation by drastically overstating what the evidence actually supports. We have to remember that a discrepancy just sitting there in isolation is not automatically evidence of wrongdoing. An isolated anomaly could easily be a different reporting period. It could be incompatible definitions between two departments, a delayed system update, duplicated entries, or literally just a simple currency conversion or human mistake. But when these anomalies stop being isolated, our methodology has to adapt. That brings us to section 2. The scrutiny threshold. Here is the crucial point. When the exact same type of inconsistency starts showing up repeatedly, say across different reporting periods, documents, or independent sources, we cross what Semvanski Labs identifies as the scrutiny threshold. The pattern hasn't necessarily proved wrongdoing, but it has absolutely changed the standard of review. At this point, the isolated arrow defense just completely loses its weight. The pattern itself demands a shift in how we review the data. Responsible analysis has to occupy that highly disciplined space right between blind dismissal and premature accusation. You need to be able to look at a pattern and state clearly, look, this does not prove intent, but it is sufficiently consistent to demand a formal explanation. Basically, your evidence should change your level of scrutiny long before it changes your level of accusation. Moving to part 3, the 6-stage pattern test. This is the structured framework we use to responsibly escalate an anomaly into a scrutinized pattern. What's really powerful about this framework is how each successive stage systematically eliminates false positives until only a genuine, verifiable pattern remains. You start with detection, just describing the observable difference without assigning any motive. Second is normalization, verifying that these records are actually comparable. Third is repetition, identifying if the anomaly returns. Fourth is independence, confirming this through truly separate sources. Fifth is the alternative explanation, where a serious investigator actively tests the pattern against competing, legitimate hypotheses. And finally, proportional escalation, matching your response strictly to the verified quality of your evidence. Let's zoom in on that second stage for a second, normalization. Before you even let yourself think about assigning motive, you have to ask this one fundamental question. Were these records actually intended to mirror each other in the first place? You have to verify the entity, the specific time period, the exact currency, and the scope. Without this normalization step, your comparison is just going to generate false suspicion. And when we look at the fourth stage, independence, the standard here is absolute. A serious investigator has to rely on completely separate, unlinked sources. Think about it. Pulling 5 different tabs from the exact same flawed spreadsheet gives you source quantity, sure, but it absolutely fails the test for source independence. 5 documents from the same spreadsheet are not 5 confirmations. This brings us to Section 4, calibrating investigative evidence. This builds out what is arguably our most critical skill as investigators. Calibration is all about knowing exactly where your evidence sits at any given moment, and never, ever collapsing these distinct layers into one another. You start at the base with an observable artifact. Maybe it's a weird number on a page or a missing timestamp. You verify its origin, make sure it hasn't been altered, and it becomes an authenticated technical fact. Chain a few of those technical facts together, and you might draw an analytical inference. That inference then leads to an unresolved hypothesis about what is actually going wrong behind the scenes. But here is the critical part. None of those earlier layers equate to a final legal determination. You have to accurately categorize what you are looking at all times to maintain the integrity of your findings. This boundary must remain absolute. A recurring difference definitively establishes that a systematic and material process is actively occurring. But without additional evidence, like internal communications showing knowledge, instructions, or active concealment, the evidence cannot establish the intent, the knowledge, or the specific reason why it's occurring. The responsible conclusion is often simply stating that a material discrepancy exists, but its cause remains undetermined. Finally, Section 5, limits and practical actions, because we have to recognize the limits of our findings and actually apply targeted practical steps. So what do you actually do? The next time you encounter a discrepancy, apply this exact timeline. Minute 1. Ask yourself, did these records actually share an intended match? Stop assuming they did. Hour 1. Are the underlying variables properly normalized? And by day 1, if that pattern persists, you shift your question from "was there an error" to "what systemic process is actively producing this specific result?" Ultimately, the real investigative failure isn't refusing to accuse someone too early. The real failure is looking at a fully documented, independent, recurring pattern and choosing to treat it like a simple typo. When the data shifts, your methodology has to shift right along with it. So ask yourself, are you calibrating your standard of review, or are you just hiding behind the false binary? Because at the end of the day, responsible inquiry relies on continuous evidence verification. Semvanski Labs and Research, forensics over fiction.